Kick us off, I'll introduce Ben Speakman, who's going to talk about ActiveObjects. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Summit. I'm Ben Speakman. I'm on the developer relations team at Atlassian, and we're here to talk about ActiveObjects. We don't have a lot of time. Let's get to it. There's four things we're going to cover. What is ActiveObjects, the thing, what can it help you do? I'll show you a quick example of how to use it, and I'm going to show you how to get it into your plugins. We're going to be going over a lot of technical information. You don't need to feel pressed to write it all down at once. I'm going to have links at the end that you can visit, that you can write down and visit a later time to find all the information you need to know. You're not going to learn everything about ActiveObjects today, but I'm going to get you interested and show you how to get started. So first of all, what is ActiveObjects? The active record pattern is something Martin Fowler has developed, and is popular in a lot of things like Rails, like Grails, Django, and any web framework, really. The idea is that an object is also a database table. And this term, an object, is called entity. The class name of the object is what becomes the table name in the database. Every field in the object, date, time, first name, last name, etc., becomes a column name. And any instance of the object it corresponds to a row in the database. What this means is that your data is manifested as object models you can operate on as if they were objects in the native language, as opposed to worrying about database interaction. The ActiveObject paradigm also exposes state methods so you can interface with these objects, and when you change them, their changes go to the database, even though from your perspective you're just changing a Java object. Here's what any object looks like. This is very simple. All you have are properties, getters and setters, that are appropriate to the model that you're using. The key thing here is that the top interface is called netjava.ao entity. All this does is add an ID method so you can get the primary key for an object. But behind the scenes, what it does is it registers this object with ActiveObjects and says, this is now a special thing. And I'll show you what I mean. The entity manager is something in part of ActiveObjects. It's a class so you get component injected into your plugin, like with a number of services. You can create an object by using the entity manager with ao.create. You can get an object by its primary key, because again, each object implements that entity interface, giving you a private key. You can update the object's properties. You can eventually save that object to the database. When you call page.save, your changes will persist to the database underneath, as if you'd written them yourself. Finally, you can just make pages go away. So this is basically simple stuff. Where it gets powerful is we have more interesting things, like I want to know how many page objects I have in the database. OK, I can count them. You also start getting into stuff like very powerful finders. Give me all the page objects. You need to iterate on all of them at once. Obviously, this is something you don't want to do a lot because of memory problems, but if you need to do it, you can do it. Then you start getting stuff like query selectors, where you can say, find me the pages that meet a certain criteria. And this gets very powerful because you're basically doing a complete SQL select from where kind of thing. And we can model that syntax inside ActiveObjects. And finally, one cool thing you can do is that the entity manager can isolate changes between different versions of the objects. So if you have one object that you've already turned into an entity, and later you add a new field to that object, and ActiveObjects will notice that, and if you say ActiveObjects migrate, as we see at the bottom here, it will go in there and add the columns to the database that you have not already put in there. So this makes upgrading your data model pretty easy. All you do is tell ActiveObjects, hey, it's time to migrate, and it'll figure out what it's time to do, and it'll do it for you. Which is kind of cool. There are certain things about ActiveObjects that are very, very useful. And doing useful things is what developer relations is trying to get people to understand. Anything we can do to make it easier to develop plugins, more fun to develop plugins, that's what we want to do. Of course, what I've just described is a very short outline of a very powerful system. So I need to show you how you can actually use it in your plugins. That's the key of what we're talking about today. ActiveObjects itself. The active record pattern is something that's been documented for several years now. The ActiveObjects project lives on java.net and is an open source project that Atlassian, especially Sam Liberego, who is now the maintainer of ActiveObjects upstream, and also the guy who did all the work for ActiveObjects inside our plugin system. So he deserves the lion's share of the credit for what I'm talking about today. The project has been packaged as a plugin. What this means is that the components, the entity manager, the entity interface and stuff, are imported via the component import mechanism inside the plugin system. This is something that a lot of you should already be familiar with. If not, it's not that hard to understand. What we have now supports Jira and Confluence. And the big news is that, as you've already probably heard, this is going to be bundled in Jira 4.4, what we're calling Developer Preview, but we expect it to be feature complete. We're trying to get into Confluence 4. I can't say for certain that it's going to be there or not, but that's the plan right now. However, you don't have to wait for these bundled releases. If you want to install the plugin today and work on it, you can. And I'll give you links to that at the end of the presentation. So here's the important things to understand. The ActiveObjects configuration uses the same database that the product is already configured to use. There is no additional setup, there's no XML tinkering, there's no messing around with anything. You install a plugin, it works. Backup and restore also works how you would expect. Backup and restore is triggered inside each product by a different mechanism. You can back up to XML, you can back up to data, whatever you need to do. The ActiveObjects plugin understands those processes and will integrate them into its own system. So if you're using Jira and you use the backup command with Jira, the ActiveObjects plugin will also realize that a backup event has occurred, and it will stream its data out to the same place the Jira backup goes. So backup is just part of everything else. ActiveObjects, for all you know, lives inside the plugin, and system administrators don't have to do anything special to keep it to work when they upgrade or when they change their systems. Each plugin, when it's used with ActiveObjects, has a private space. What this means is that the table names that actually get created for ActiveObjects go through a transformation process which makes sure that only the plugin that created them can locate them. So if you want to, say, have one plugin that does data storage, and you want to have other plugins that use your data storage, they don't all use the same ActiveObjects API. What you do, you put ActiveObjects in one plugin, and then you can expose that via components, public components, which you can then import into your other plugins the same way you would with the ActiveObjects plugin itself. Here's how it looks. Component import is something that, again, you've all said. Basically, in a nutshell, it says, find me an instance of this interface and inject it into my plugin. Okay. The fancy new part here is what we call the AO module. And it has a description and a key, just like anything else. But the important thing here is the entity elements underneath it. Each ActiveObject class you declare that extends that entity interface has to be registered here. This is how ActiveObjects knows that these classes are magical and should be decorated with the same methods and should be amenable to find, create, all the good stuff I showed you. Finally, you have to show that you're depending on this plugin. So the ActiveObjects plugin goes in your POM, and this is basically all it is. Depend on this group ID, this artifact ID, and say what version you're going to use. When the plugins get bundled, this will no longer be necessary, obviously, but for now, it's something you need to worry about. Again, in general, the problem of combining plugins, so that if your plugin requires other plugins, you can install them all at once. That's something that we're working on. We'll hopefully have a better answer for you soon. But right now, it's going to be like this. And that's it. Here are the 3 links that I want you to understand. The first is a more in-depth tutorial of what you can do, so write that one down. The second is all the documentation we have for ActiveObjects, which is growing all the time, but fortunately it's not a very complex system, so write that down as well. And finally, the plugin SDK, which all of you should be using if you're not already. And that's it. Thank you, guys.